Edu Arctic2, Polar Research for Education, innovative program in Poland and Norway. Webinars.
Bread, that's brilliant. As I said before, for those who haven't been there yet, in the bottom right of the Cisco window, there's the option to choose the chat, and you can write messages here. And we're always very curious to hear where you're from and if you have pupils with you or if you're on your own. And that helps me to sort of pitch the lecture a bit towards who I'm talking to. I am Gabi Wagner. I'm a zoologist and I work for the Norwegian Institute of Bioeconomics. And I sit in Tromsø in northern Norway, which I believe is pretty much the most northern university there is. I work on Arctic animals, Svalbard ptarmigan, reindeer, and I am also a musher, so I use dogs privately, and I'm also interested in them professionally. I would say we will slowly start to the lectures, so I will talk in my lecture and you can ask questions in the chat, or you can also interrupt me. Sometimes I don't always see when there's a question coming in, but then Hilda sends me a message and then we can take a stop and have a discussion. Otherwise, we'll take it at the end of the lecture. And if we have time enough, I have also prepared a Kahoot, which you can take with your class, for example, and I'll make it available so that you can access it later on with your class in teaching. Okay, I would say we go straight into medias res. I'll start sharing my screen. Here we go. And that should work. Does that work? Maybe you can send me a, oops, quick thumbs up, Hilde, so I know you're in business. Brilliant, thank you very much. Right, sled dogs. Something that a lot of people like to experience. There's a lot of tourism in sled dogs. In the last few years, there's been enormous interest in sled dog tourism. So the enterprises are popping up everywhere. And with Corona, all these companies have a big problem because they end up with something like 200-300 dogs and no income, which is a problem. But let's look a bit closer. What's so special about sled dogs? Here's a part of a pack from my own house and from a friend. These are all Siberian huskies, which we're driving on a sled pretty much in my backyard. Now, a lot of us, especially us mushers, we like to think that the Siberian husky or the husky itself is, as it's so close in appearance to the wolf, is closely related to the wolf, unlike certain other dogs, which we think really have nothing much to do with the wild type. But is that really so? If we look at the genetics, the genes of these dogs, and we compare them, it turns out that, of course, the Chihuahua is fairly well distanced from the wolf, but actually so is the husky. So even though he looks a lot like a wolf, he's actually just as closely or not closely related to the wolf as a Chihuahua. And that means that the same amount of breeding has gone into both these breeds. I'll try to use the laser pointer after all. So the same amount of selection and breeding has gone into a husky breed as much as into a Chihuahua breed, only they have been bred for completely different purposes, and that's what makes them so different. But genetically, they're both equally far removed from the wolf. And that is a good thing, because humans have actually, over many 10,000s of years, worked very hard to make wolves not like dogs. Wolves have a few properties that make it very difficult to actually live with them. So the idea to interbreed huskies, for example, with wolves is a really bad one, because you're losing a lot of the properties that humankind has spent many, many years to get rid of. And that is mostly the reactive behavior of wolves, low threshold for biting, for attack, or for fleeing. So what we're looking for in domesticated dogs is a pro-social activity, an interest to cooperate, an interest to try to work out what is it that the human wants, and that will then get me food. So humans have actually worked very hard over a very long time period to get rid of all the wolf behaviors. So the fact that the husky is just as far removed from the wolf as the Chihuahua is a good thing. And especially when we're looking at sled dogs, that's a particularly good thing, because what we like to see in a husky is a high level of collaboration. On the one hand, with the musher, so the person driving the sled, but also between the dogs. So we want the huskies to work shoulder to shoulder, to work very closely, pull together, work together into a line of propulsion for the sled, whereas the collaboration pattern for a wolf looks completely different. So a wolf has got a completely different personal space. They need a lot of space around them. Two wolves would not work so closely together and work shoulder to shoulder. That would end in a bad fight, because wolves have a very big personal space. So it is actually very important to not have wolves in the pack, even though they're bigger and stronger. We actually want a different set of behaviors than we see in wolves. And the whole discussion has gained new interest last year when, due to climate change, a puppy has appeared in the permafrost in Yakutsk in Siberia. And this mummified puppy is 18,000 years old, and you can see it has an amazing level of conservation. So we have absolutely everything there. All the soft tissues are there, the hairs are there. You can even see the whiskers. He still has his puppy teeth. So he's only a few weeks old. And he has thrown up a lot of questions about the domestication of dogs. So it's a very old specimen. And the first thing the researchers wanted to know, of course, is that a wolf puppy or is it a dog puppy? And they couldn't determine from the looks, even though everything is perfectly maintained. So they took gene samples and ran gene analysis, and they still could not tell. So it's still, and as far as I know, it's up to this day, it's still not clear if this puppy is a dog or a wolf. And he has been called Dogor, which is in the local dialect, it means friend. But it's, of course, also a joke in English. Is it a dog or is it a wolf? And that actually has raised the question, is the wolf actually just as far removed from this sort of dog or wolf as the husky is? So maybe the wolf, the husky, and the Chihuahua are equally far removed from a common ancestor. So this has shed a completely new light on the evolution of domesticated dogs that have been selected for use by humans and collaboration with humans. So let us look a bit at the evolution of dogs. So we think that dog domestication has started very early on, about 40,000 years ago. We have an indication that dogs and humans were living together and probably collaborating. And dogs have probably been used for hunting in war, for transport, for guarding settlements. They've probably also been eaten. They can be used for clothing or maybe just company. Dogor appears roughly here. And then we see the first dogs that have popped up in the Americas around 12,000 years ago. And the Arctic, as we know it now, has been settled roughly probably around 4,500 years ago. And now the huskies, that as we know them, the sled dogs, are very closely associated with the Thule people, which appeared in the Arctic around 1,000 years ago. So these are probably the people that had sled dogs very close to as we know them today. So we have actually, apart from Dogo, we have very little indication of what these dogs looked like or what they were used for. But we have, of course, a much better record of what has happened in the last few hundred years. So let us look at this very last piece of on the time scale here. So this is what we're dealing with now for the rest of the talk. And these are the dogs that we know of at least 500 years ago, the last 500 years. So this is a tiny, tiny window. What is known as ancient breeds are dog breeds for which we have records in writing from written resources or from descriptions or archaeological funds that are at least 500 years old. And those include the Malamut, the Siberian husky, the Chow Chow, Shiba Inu, Akita Inus, which is a Japanese breed, Spitz, Samoyeds, Greenland or Canadian Inuit sled dogs. Now, obviously, there are other ancient dog breeds as well, so I'm only focusing on the ones that are important for the sled dog evolution. So what we're talking about here is the first, shall we say, 40,000 years. We're pretty much talking about evolution, a very slow process in which dogs have been domesticated, whereas in the rest of the talk, we're really talking about very selected breeding for a particular purpose, and that is dog sledding, using dogs for transport, and that has happened over the last, shall we say, about 1,000 years. So very selective breeding process for a particular task that we're dealing with here. And I would just like to very briefly introduce you to the most, maybe the most important and most common ancient sled dog breeds that we know of, just so you know what they look like. The probably basic breed for all sled dogs is the Malamut, which is a big dog. He's slow, they have very thick fur, they have a curly tail, they're very stubborn, they have a strong hunting instinct, they're often not nice with other dogs, especially other dog breeds, and they have a reputation for eating other dogs that are not Malamuts. So very strong hunting instinct. They're extremely stubborn, a very difficult breed to have, but they are of course very strong and they're superbly adapted to the Arctic. A very big dog, and as you can see, very thick fur, so they're not fast runners. They're slow, but they're very strong. Equally strong, we also have the Greenland dog or Canadian Inuit sled dogs. This is also an ancient breed that has been isolated in the Canadian Arctic and Greenland for at least 950 years. So these are the dogs that are most closely associated with the Thule people. And they had a superb genetic isolation, and up to now, it's still not allowed to introduce any other dog breeds to Greenland to preserve this breed. They are actually endangered because less and less people use them. They have been replaced by snow scooters and helicopters. So there are less and less people who actually keep the Greenland sled dog for its original purpose. And there are a lot of projects trying to preserve them. Now, unlike any snow scooter, these are very fierce dogs. They are also used to hunt polar bears, and we should not think of them as a pet dog as we know them. So they're usually not used to being handled, petted. They are have a bit wilder setup there. So if you ever go to Greenland, do not approach these dogs. If you want to feed them snacks, they're most likely to choose your hand over your snack that you offer. So very different to the other dog breeds that we're dealing with. Here's the Siberian husky, which in character is almost the opposite. These dogs have been used by the Chukchi people in Siberia, And they have been used as company dogs for transport and for sledding and to carry loads, but they have also been used to keep babies warm. So all aggression towards humans has been very selectively bred out of these dogs. They have a very flirty attitude towards people. They love cuddles, they're very contact seeking, and they can run very long distances. And they have been discovered by the famous Norwegian-American musher, Lennart Seppala, who had been given as a present a few Siberian huskies, which to my knowledge are the only Siberian huskies that have made it out of Siberia into the breed. And he discovered that they could run longer and faster with less food than all the other sled dogs he was employing in his professional setup to deliver post in remote Alaska. So he very strongly focused on the Siberian husky and was breeding them, and also made them a protected breed with a pedigree. So the Siberian husky, despite its name, is actually an American breed. One problem with them in terms of a modern setup is in Siberia, the huskies have been set free for the summer. Nobody was bothering to feed them at that time. So the huskies had to go and fend for themselves, and only in autumn and winter were they kept in the settlements and fed. And that means the hunting instinct is extremely strong in the Siberian husky, and they should therefore never ever be kept off the lead. So you have to keep very close tabs on them. They hunt everything that is small and moving. Also other dogs. Also a sled dog breed, but of a slightly different background is the Samoyed, and actually all the Spitz breeds. The Spitz breeds have got smaller ears and this very typical curly tail. The husky has got sort of a sickle tail, but the Spitz dogs have got this very curly tail, and they have a herding background actually. So they have been used to herd reindeer, for example. They have also been used to pull sleds, but they do not go over very large distances. They are very strong. So here the focus is more on pulling heavy weights. And a lot of these Spitz dog breeds have also been used in polar exploration because they have superb fur to cope with very low temperatures, and they're very strong. Now back to our timeline. We have now looked a bit at the ancient breeds that we know of that have gone into the sled dog gene pool. You can see they have a sort of slightly different background, but all of them can be used in a sledding context. And now let's get a bit closer to what we now know as sled dogs. So during the Alaska Gold Rush, the northwestern states, especially Alaska, of the Northern Americas and also in Canada, suddenly had a huge requirement for transporting heavy loads across the outback, and there were no roads at the time, there were no aeroplanes, no cars that could travel in winter. So dogs were the transport mode of choice, and there was a huge demand for sled dogs. And what happened was that the Alaskans and Canadians also used the genetic background of the existing Inuit and native Indian sled dogs and crossed them with a lot of European breeds, mostly very big breeds like Hoverwarts, St. Bernards, Labradors. So they crossed all sorts of dogs and they bred like crazy to just get the amount of dogs that they needed to transport everything to the areas where the gold was found. So that was pretty much the origin of the Alaska Husky. So they're a crossbreed of all sorts of dogs that were just big and strong enough and had enough fur to survive the Alaskan winter and to pull a sled. So this is what we now mostly know of as the Alaska Husky, which is just a jumbled bag of all sorts of breeds. During racing, as I already said, which also became a hit during those years, it was discovered by Leonard Seppala that the Siberian husky, the Chukchi dogs he had been given, actually had a better aptitude for going very fast, for going very long distances, for endurance, while actually being a bit friendlier in character and needing a lot less food than all these huge European breeds that were interbred with the native dogs. So he started to focus on breeding these Siberian huskies, and for many years he won all the races. Nowadays, since the advent of planes and scooters have overtaken the need for all these dogs for sledding, the Alaska Husky is now the breed of choice in races. So they have, in a very short time, like over 50 years, they have been selectively bred for racing, and they have now long overtaken the Siberian Husky in dog racing. Because they sort of got rid of a lot of the properties from the Siberian Husky in order to make them better races. Now, the Siberian Husky can go very long and can survive in very cold temperatures, but it's exactly this low temperature resistance that makes them also slower runners, because the very warm fur makes them too hot, so they can't go above a certain speed because they would overheat. Whereas the Alaska Huskies, which have a lot of the short-haired breeds in their gene pool, they have less fur, which means they might have to wear blankets and coats during racing, and especially during resting times. But that means they can go a lot faster. So nowadays, the Alaska Husky has changed from being a very heavy, big dog to being a very lean, fast dog. And this is what we see now. Those are the mostly Alaska Huskies that are used for leisure and for racing, and we'll talk about that a bit later on. So this is the modern Alaskan Husky that we see nowadays. So just to recap, to put this into a geographical background, we have the very long isolated dogs, the Greenland and Canadian sled dog here in Greenland. And as I said, in Greenland, the Greenland dogs are actually by law protected. So you're not allowed to take any dogs into Greenland that are not Greenland sled dogs. Then we have the basic breed, the Alaskan Malamut, which was there, which was used by the native Indians and by the Inuit. And we have also an interbreeding with the Siberian Husky, and mostly through Leonard Seppala, who introduced them. So here we already have an interbreeding that started for racing purposes. And then, of course, for the Alaska Husky, we have all these other European dog breeds that have been interbred with the Malamut, the Siberian Husky, in order to produce, in the beginning, very heavy dogs that carried loads, and is now mostly used for racing. So these are now the fastest Arctic sled dogs. And some of them have got very thick double-coated fur, others have much thinner fur. And basically, the thinner the fur, the faster the dog, but it also means they might have problems coping in the cold. So this is sort of the genetic background and the geographical background for the sled dogs as we know them today. And the Alaska Husky is very likely what you're going to see if you go into any tourism company that provides dog sledding. What are we looking for in a sled dog? What makes a good sled dog? Mostly, they need a very strong will to pull. Not all dogs have that, and those dogs, even amongst the sled dogs that don't have that, are taken out very early in their training and are usually sold to people who just like a tour buddy. But a dog that does not pull and keep the lead straight is not going to be used in a dog sled. They have to be enduring, they have to be strong, so they need a good bone framework, they need very good paws. We like to see haired, furred ears that keep the cold and the wind out and the snow out. We like to see a fairly big snout, which allows the dogs to warm up the ice cold air. And that means they lose less heat and less humidity when they breathe hard, when they're panting while they're working. We like to see very good paws, good skin on paws that doesn't crack, that doesn't run into sores. And ideally, we also want to see fur on their feet that act as snowshoes and also protect the feet from the cold and also from ice. Now, this can work over long distances, especially if the dogs are used to running a lot. But in the very long distances, when dogs run like 100, 200 kilometers a day, we would use boots on them anyway to protect their paws. And then, of course, we want a nice bushy tail, which the dog can curl around its head when it's getting very unpleasant and stormy and icy, and they have to just curl up and let themselves snow in. And that is why we usually see the sickle-shaped or the curly tail in the sled dog breeds. That is actually there to protect their face and their body openings, the eyes, the nose, and the ears against winter storms. So if you have those things, you pretty much are in business with the sled dog. And then there are, of course, the mental properties. What we want is a dog that has very good communication, a dog that is trying to work out, what does this person want from me? And also a dog that likes to collaborate with others. So these dogs spend most of their time in very closely with each other. So you can't have dogs that fight with other dogs. So they need to be super socialized with people and with other dogs. One thing we see in sled dog setups is that those dogs usually only know huskies, and there appears to be a sort of dialect in their dog language that sometimes can make it difficult for huskies to communicate with other dog breeds. So in a family setting, if you get a husky puppy, you want to make sure they meet a lot of other dog breeds, because otherwise you can get into difficulties. They might start to pick fights with other dog breeds simply because they can't understand them. They can't communicate properly with them. A bit about the coat, what makes the husky coat so different. Arctic dogs have what's called a double-coated fur, so they have a very warm undercoat that thins out in summer and gets very, very dense in winter. And it traps not just the warmth from the body and helps the dog to stay warm, but it also helps the dog to cool down in winter. And that is the reason why you really never ever should shave your husky. You can brush out their fur in summer when they're molting, but you really have to not shave them, because then you disturb the annual cycle in the undercoat, and that means the huskies can actually not keep cool in summer. So it's a bit counterintuitive. You might think, oh, they've got really thick fur, they might get hot in summer, but actually if you shave them, they get even hotter. And then of course you have the long primary guard hair, and they are especially protected, and they're actually water resistant, which makes at least the Siberian husky a rather clean dog, apart from the mess with the hair when they're molting. But once they're done with the molt, they're really clean dogs. Their coat is water resistant, and most dirt and water actually just drops off them like water off a duck's back. So they're actually surprisingly clean dogs to keep, unlike many of the Alaska Huskies, which don't have this water resistant fur and can get very dirty. Now a bit about the physiology. What makes it that makes the husky so enduring? How is it possible that this 20 to 30 kilo pack of dog can run in the longest races 1,500 kilometers? They run incredible distances at a high speed, around 15 kilometers an hour and more. I certainly couldn't cycle at that speed over 1,500 kilometers, and certainly not in 5 days. So what makes them such superb runners? We have to look very closely at their muscles, of course. Here is a muscle that is separated into a lot of blood vessels, so they're very richly perfused with fresh blood to provide the oxygen and the energy the dogs need all the time. But we actually find the secret in each cell. Each cell has a sort of power plant in it, little organs within the cells. They're called mitochondria. And these parts of the cell produce the energy for the cell to stay alive and to provide its function in the case of the muscle, this constant contraction during running. And the first secret of the sled dogs is they have way more of these mitochondria than any other animal, at least that I know of. Well, maybe whales are very close, but so they plainly have much more of the power plants in each cell than other animals have. So more mitochondria is the first secret. The other secret is in their blood. They have very richly infused muscle, so a lot of blood vessels in there. That's one thing, so just the plain volume is there. And the other thing is that their myoglobin, that is the pigment that binds oxygen. We have hemoglobin in our blood that is flowing through the body, but we also have myoglobin, which binds oxygen in muscle cells. Myo meaning muscle, globin means a globe because it's a globular molecule, and that binds oxygen. And the huskies have way more myoglobin than any other animal, terrestrial animal. So that means their muscles actually are themselves already packed with oxygen. So the husky doesn't have to breathe so very hard. They're actually already saturated with oxygen already when they're resting. And so they can breathe less than another animal would have to at the same workload. So more mitochondria, better circulation, and more myoglobin, and that ends up in a much higher oxygen flow, which you can measure in muscle tissue from an Alaska husky. You can see that they're at a much higher oxygen flux than a human or a racing horse could ever achieve. And that is without them breaking into a sweat. Not that they can sweat. This also means that they work a lot more efficiently than other dogs. So here is a comparison between northern dog breeds, so sled dogs, a retriever, and hound dogs. Hounds are actually much faster than huskies, but they also have to work a lot harder to get the oxygen in. So they have to breathe a lot more than a husky does. And you can see just measuring the volume of oxygen these dog breeds use when they're working hard. Here you can see the speed in meters per second. So the faster they get, the more they have to breathe, of course. But you can see a hound, which is actually much faster than a husky, has to breathe and pant a lot more. The retriever actually can't run that very fast. And the sled dogs can actually run quite fast, not as fast as a hound, but they can keep it up for longer and they can get to these speeds as well. But they breathe a lot less, so their panting is not as strong as you would see it in a hound. And when they stop running, their breathing calms down very quickly. So usually it just takes a few breaths and then they breathe normally again and can close their mouth. The other secret is in the biometrics of their body. So you can see that a hound or a retriever have got a fairly large angle between the back and the hips, fairly large, whereas the wolf and the sled dog actually have got a rather steep angle. So they're quite square in build. And that's actually what you would like, what you're looking for in an Alaska husky or a Siberian husky. You want a fairly square, compact dog with steep angles, and that makes them better runners. They also have, and I can't quite explain how that makes them more efficient, but it does. They also have, very much like the wolf, the habit of keeping their head down. So they don't use any, I guess they just don't use any energy on their muscles. Hounds and retrievers put their head up the faster they run, whereas the husky gets the head down much lower, just like the wolf, and that seems to cost them less energy. So there are difference in plainly their gait compared to other dogs. And these are, of course, the properties that we have selected for in the breeding of sled dogs. And then the last secret, probably the most crucial one, is the fuel secret. And that is still not entirely understood, and there's a lot of research going into that. But it's very complicated to explain, but I'll try to keep it as simple as I can. Basically, all mammals have got two ways of fueling their body when they're working hard. You can either have glycogen, which you can get in starch and from sugars, and that is sort of a very fast, clean burning fuel. So you eat it and you can very quickly digest it and use it. Whereas you could also use fat and protein. Now, those are more slow burning. They actually require energy to burn them, but it's also a fuel source. Now, when most mammals run, we have a large store of fat and protein, which we can use up. But in order to burn the fat and the protein, we need the glycogen. So we need a fast available and easily digestible source of food from starches and from sugar. And once that clean, fast burning flame burns out, we can't actually use the fat and the protein fuel anymore. And that leads to a burnout. Whereas the husky just does away with the glycogen. So they very rarely use it in endurance races at all. And instead, they can just use the fat and the protein. Now, how exactly that works is quite complicated. But for the purpose of this, let us just say they manage it. So they don't need any of the vegetables, the starches, the sugars. They just use fat and protein. And that is unsurprisingly exactly what the sled dogs have been bred to do. They are used to the Arctic diet. They need a lot of fat and basically no starch. And that they have in common with other Arctic animals like polar bears, foxes, and of course also human, here with a narwhal, which mostly consists of, well, pretty much exclusively consists of fat and protein. But they still think that pancakes are okay. So they will also take some starch if they can get it. A bit about the sled itself. So how do we get these dogs to pull a sled? Obviously, we have to attach them to the sled, and they're basically two ways of doing it. On the one hand, the classic Inuit setup is a fan hitch. So you have one sled and you have all the dogs fanning out in front of the sled, as you can see here. So they all have basically the same length of line and they all run next to each other. And as you can see here, it's super important that you have dogs that are happy to work with each other, that are happy to have their shoulders touching the next dog without starting a fight. So that's the classic fan hitch. Now, it's if you think about it, it's not the most energy efficient way because each dog pulls into a slightly different angle. So the actual forwards pull for the sled is not ideal, but it has the big advantage if you're going over sea ice or over a mountain that might have cracks in the ice. You have a good chance that even if a dog breaks through the ice, there are enough other dogs that stand on firm ground and can pull that dog out. So it's not the most efficient way of moving forwards, but it's very safe, relatively. Saying that, a lot of Inuit teams disappear in the sea ice. So once the stuff is moving, it is one of the most dangerous, or probably the most dangerous thing to do, to travel on sea ice. But Inuit know what they're doing, but accidents happen. The other way of hitching the dogs is in a line. And this is what we see, of course, in the racing setup. All the dogs pull in the same line and they're all in one line in front of the sled. So you have a middle line and the dogs are in pairs set up next to this line. And you have a middle line that is attached to the sled. You can see it going through here. and in the back you have the wheel dogs. So they are usually the strongest, biggest dogs that have a lot of power, that can actually give the sled that first pull that you need to get it going. It's actually not so easy to move on ice. In the lead, you have the lead dogs. Those are usually the cleverest and most hardworking dogs. They are the ones that actually communicate with the musher. So if you're standing in the back there, you can be up to 20 meters removed from your lead dog. So those need to be the dogs that know the commands. They know right, left, stop, slow down, wait, lie down. So they are the cleverest dogs, and they're usually supported by the swing dogs, which can usually also be exchanged with the lead dogs. And that is to make sure if the lead dog is very busy, for example, breaking a trail through the deep snow or finding a track, that's what they also have to be good at, then the swing dogs can actually help to keep the team going and to pull all these other dogs forwards, and then all the rest are pretty much the muscles that keep the whole thing moving and make out the power that you need to pull the sled you have, either a very heavy one or a very light one. You can see here you need dogs with very good communication, and especially the lead dogs, particularly in classic setups, they need to also have a very strong will. So if necessary, those are the dogs that override the musher. So those are the dogs you trust with your life when you're going on sea ice, because they can feel what you can't feel. They may know when the ice breaks and not. They can smell out the trail. They can make their way through the deep snow. And that is why sled dogs are so incredibly stubborn and very difficult to train, because they have actually been selected to make their own decisions, to be stubborn and to go against the command of the musher when they think it's life-threatening. So that's what makes sled dogs a slightly difficult breed to work with. Oh yeah, and here I've made myself a little reminder to show you some props. Very briefly, I hope you can see this. This is a mushing belt that you wear around your hip, and it's attached to your legs. And in the front here, you attach yourself to the sled so that the dogs don't make off with the sled. This is, this is a harness. So the head goes through here, and it actually puts pressure on certain points on the skeleton of the dogs, and that's what actually makes them want to pull. So those are the trigger points, and then it should go comfortably back to the back. And here you attach the lead, and here that's maybe, you can see it in the picture. So this is a neckline. So this is how you attach the dogs either to each other or to the midline to keep them all nice and in a line. And now I'll just quickly show you some of the uses for dogs today. Obviously, there is still the traditional hunting and transport use for the dogs when you have to transport a seal or a whale with a few hundred kilos back home. It's good to have strong dogs. In polar expeditions, they have been used to make it to the North Pole, to the South Pole, make it through Antarctica. In those cases, especially by the explorer Roald Amundsen, the dogs were not just used to pull the sleds, but as the sleds got lighter, as the food was eaten, the dogs themselves turned into food. So they were actually part of the food package. Most Alaska dogs, Alaska Huskies, are now used in racing, and here is the 1,500 kilometer Iditarod trail from Anchorage to Nome. And that is replaying the Serum run of the 1930s, I think. And those are dogs that have to, run a very long time, very hard. So they do 1,500 kilometers in 8 days is the record, and 3 hours or close to 4 hours. Incredible athletes. And obviously not every husky can do that. So those dogs are generations of breeding, and they are incredible runners. And then of course there's the leisure use. We still, like the Inuit did and the Chukchi people did, we use them to transport stuff in backpacks, and that's also very good training for retired sled dogs. We use them to pull us on skis, sometimes with a pulk in the back, or in summer we can use them with a kick bike, which is a lot safer than a bicycle. So this is sort of roller scooter, and that's very good training in summer. And we use them on tours, and this on the right here, this is called Nordic style. This is when you have a husky in the front, you have a pulk, and the masha is not standing on the sled, but actually on her own skis. And one quirky use of sled dogs is the serious patrol. Denmark is responsible for the defense of Greenland, and this area of Greenland, which is mostly a national park, is defended with its 160,000 square kilometers, about half as big as Norway, by 12 men, which are equipped with 6 dog teams, and they patrol the Greenland coast every winter to make sure there are no intruders and there's no illegal use of Greenland's resources. So those are pretty much the biggest and the best cared for sled dogs in Greenland. What huskies are not good for is do not leave them unattended with your livestock or chickens, as in this case. They will hunt down and eat all they can, and they're neither very good gardeners. With that, yes, a few tips that you might like to see. There's an excellent book about the sledge patrol in Greenland by David Howarth and how they've been employed in the Second World War. And then there is a very good movie about Leonard Seppala and his lead dog Togo, which provided serum to the settlement in Nome when there was no other way of getting there in winter through the ice and snow. And with that, I'm at the end. Thank you very much for your attention. I think we're running short of time. I suggest we do this Kahoot another time. So Hilda will send this out. I'll stop sharing my screen and we'll have a look if there are any questions. Right, if you have any questions, you can either turn on your camera and talk to us directly, or you can write it in the chat. The chat window is on the bottom right of the Cisco window. Oh yeah, thank you very much for the link. Does anyone have?
Watch other recordings from webinars on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/EduArctic. Edu Arctic2, from polar research to scientific passion, innovative nature education in Poland and Norway receives a grant of 240,000 euros received from Iceland, Liechtenstein and Norway under EEA funds.